Welcome back to the channel. Today, we drift deep into the mysterious and often unsettling world of ancient history. When most people imagine the queens of ancient Egypt, they picture golden crowns, magnificent palaces, and a life surrounded by unimaginable luxury. These royal women are often remembered as powerful figures standing beside mighty pharaohs, worshipped by their people and immortalized in towering temples and ancient carvings. But behind the glittering jewelry and sacred ceremonies was a very different reality. The lives of ancient Egyptian queens were often filled with intense pressure, dangerous palace rivalries, forced royal marriages, and political conspiracies that could decide the fate of an entire kingdom. Living close to the throne meant living close to power, but it also meant living dangerously. In today's video, we are going to explore the disturbing and hidden side of royal life in ancient Egypt. From the struggle for heirs and the tension inside royal harems, to shocking assassination plots and queens who dared to rule as pharaohs. This is a story far more dramatic than most history books reveal. Before we begin, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more fascinating deep dives into the hidden stories of history. Your support helps the channel grow and allows us to continue exploring the mysteries of the ancient world. Now let's step back thousands of years and uncover the disturbing life of the queens of ancient Egypt. In ancient Egypt, queens were among the most powerful women in the ancient world. In a civilization where kings were believed to rule with the authority of the gods, the women closest to the throne often held extraordinary influence. Unlike many other ancient societies where royal women remained hidden from politics, Egyptian queens could play major roles in government, religion, and the stability of the kingdom itself. Their lives were surrounded by incredible luxury, elaborate ceremonies, and immense respect from the people of Egypt. They wore magnificent jewelry made of gold and precious stones, lived in palaces decorated with beautiful art, and commanded servants who attended to their every need. Statues were carved in their honor, their names were written on temple walls, and their images were preserved in tombs meant to last for eternity. To the ordinary people of Egypt, the queen was not just a royal wife but a symbol of divine harmony, a figure who helped maintain the cosmic order that Egyptians believed held the universe together. Yet behind this image of divine power and royal perfection was a reality far more complicated and often far more dangerous. The life of an Egyptian queen was filled with responsibilities, expectations, and constant political pressure that could easily turn their power into vulnerability. Their position in the royal court was never guaranteed, and their safety often depended on delicate alliances, the favor of the king, and their ability to produce an heir who could inherit the throne. In ancient Egyptian belief, the pharaoh was considered a living god, often associated with the sky god Horus and the sun god Ra. The queen therefore held a sacred role as well, acting as a partner in maintaining divine order. Titles given to queens reflected this sacred importance. They were called Great Royal Wife, King's Mother, God's Wife, and other titles that emphasized their connection to both political authority and religious tradition. These titles were not merely ceremonial, they represented real influence within the structure of Egyptian society. The Great Royal Wife in particular often stood beside the pharaoh during important rituals and public ceremonies. She participated in religious festivals and could appear in temple carvings offering gifts to the gods. In some cases, queens controlled vast estates, managed economic resources, and oversaw networks of servants, officials, and administrators who maintained their property and influence. Because Egyptian religion tied political authority closely to divine approval, the queen's presence helped reinforce the legitimacy of the king's rule. When a queen appeared beside the pharaoh in temple reliefs, it symbolized balance between masculine and feminine divine forces, something the Egyptians believed was necessary to maintain harmony in the world. Yet this symbolic power also meant that queens were deeply involved in the political struggles of the royal court. The palace of an Egyptian pharaoh was not simply a home, it was the center of political decision-making, diplomacy, military planning, and religious authority. Every official who wished to gain influence understood that proximity to the royal family could change their fortunes. As a result, the study found that the relationship between the two variables was not significant. The palace environment was filled with ambitious individuals who sought to increase their power through alliances with members of the royal household. Queens often became central figures in these networks of influence. Courtiers might seek their support in hopes that the queen would speak favorably about them to the king. Priests might cooperate with queens who sponsored temples or religious ceremonies. Military leaders might try to align themselves with royal families in order to strengthen their position in the government. Because of this, queens often became deeply involved in palace politics whether they wanted to or not. Their position placed them at the center of a delicate web of relationships that required constant attention and careful decision-making. A queen who managed these relationships successfully could become one of the most powerful figures in Egypt, sometimes rivaling the authority of the pharaoh himself. But a queen who lost favor or misjudged the political landscape could quickly find herself isolated and vulnerable. Royal courts throughout history have often been places where trust is difficult to maintain, and the courts of ancient Egypt were no different. Behind the elegant halls and decorated columns of the palace were rivalries, jealousies, and quiet power struggles that shaped the future of the kingdom. One of the most significant factors influencing the power of Egyptian queens was their ability to produce children, especially sons who could inherit the throne. Succession in ancient Egypt could be complicated, particularly when a pharaoh had children with multiple wives or partners. The queen who gave birth to the next king would often gain enormous prestige and authority, especially if her son ascended to the throne while still young. In such cases, the queen might act as regent, ruling the kingdom in her son's name until he was old enough to rule independently. This role could transform a queen into the most powerful political figure in Egypt. Acting as regent meant controlling the administration of the state, overseeing the army, managing foreign diplomacy, and maintaining relationships with powerful priesthoods that influenced Egyptian society. Some queens handled these responsibilities with remarkable skill, guiding Egypt through periods of uncertainty and ensuring stability during transitions of power. However, the importance of producing an heir also created intense pressure within the royal household. A queen who failed to produce a son could lose influence quickly, especially if another royal wife gave birth to a potential successor. Rivalries between different branches of the royal family sometimes became fierce as each faction attempted to secure the throne for its own lineage. These rivalries could extend beyond the palace into the broader political world, drawing in military commanders, priests, and powerful officials who saw opportunities to increase their own power by supporting one royal candidate over another. In such an environment, even the most respected queen could never assume her position was secure. Her influence depended on factors that could change unexpectedly: the health of the king, the birth of new royal children, shifts in political alliances, or the ambitions of rival family members. Another aspect that contributed to the power of Egyptian queens was their role in religion. Ancient Egyptian society placed enormous importance on rituals, festivals, and the relationship between the human world and the gods. The royal family stood at the center of these beliefs, serving as intermediaries between the divine realm and the people of Egypt. Queens often played important roles in these religious ceremonies. Some queens held the prestigious title of God's wife of Amun, a position that gave them authority within the powerful priesthood dedicated to the god Amun. This title allowed royal women to participate directly in temple rituals and control significant religious resources. In certain periods of Egyptian history, the god's wife of Amun commanded vast estates, employed large numbers of priests and workers, and wielded economic power comparable to that of major government officials. This blending of religious authority and political influence further elevated the status of queens within Egyptian society. Their actions were not only political decisions but also sacred acts believed to affect the favor of the gods. Because Egyptians believed that the prosperity of their land depended on maintaining divine balance, the actions of the royal family carried enormous symbolic weight. A harmonious royal household represented cosmic stability, while conflict within the palace could be seen as a threat to the natural order of the universe. This belief placed additional pressure on queens to present an image of unity and dignity, even when internal rivalries existed. Publicly, queens appeared in art and inscriptions as calm, graceful figures who supported the pharaoh and honored the gods. Privately, however, they had to navigate a world of complex relationships and hidden tensions. Historical records from ancient Egypt sometimes reveal glimpses of these struggles. Inscriptions, court documents, and archaeological discoveries show that palace life could involve conspiracies, political maneuvering, and dramatic shifts in fortune. Some queens rose to extraordinary prominence and shaped the direction of Egyptian history for decades. Others faded quickly from the historical record, their names mentioned only briefly in surviving texts before disappearing entirely. Because many historical records were created under the authority of the ruling pharaoh, the stories of queens were often preserved only when they supported the official narrative of the dynasty. If a queen fell out of favor or became associated with political conflict, her memory might be deliberately erased from monuments and inscriptions. This practice, sometimes called historical erasure, has made it difficult for modern historians to fully understand the lives of many royal women. Statues were destroyed, names were chiseled from stone carvings, and entire chapters of royal history were rewritten to emphasize the achievements of later rulers. As a result, the power once held by many queens has been partially hidden beneath layers of silence left by ancient political decisions. Yet the fragments that remain still reveal the remarkable influence these women could wield. Some queens acted as diplomats who helped maintain alliances with foreign kingdoms. Others oversaw building projects, sponsored temples, and influenced religious reforms that affected the entire civilization. In rare cases, queens even ascended the throne as pharaohs themselves, adopting royal titles and ruling Egypt as sovereign leaders. Their reigns demonstrated that although Egyptian society was largely patriarchal, its political and religious traditions allowed exceptional women to rise to the highest levels of authority. Nevertheless, the opportunity to hold such power also carried enormous risk. The closer someone stood to the throne, the more they became a target for political intrigue. Queens who gained influence inevitably attracted rivals who wished to undermine them. Members of the royal family themselves could become competitors, especially in disputes over succession. Younger princes, ambitious relatives, and rival wives might see the removal of a powerful queen as a path toward greater influence. The combination of family relationships and political competition created a volatile environment where loyalty could shift rapidly. Trust within the palace could never be taken for granted. Even servants and officials who appeared devoted to the royal household might secretly support another faction within the court. Because of this, queens had to be constantly aware of the changing political landscape around them. Their survival often depended on careful diplomacy, strategic alliances, and the ability to anticipate potential threats before they became dangerous. Despite these challenges, the image presented to the people of Egypt remained one of harmony and divine stability. Temple reliefs showed queens standing proudly beside their kings, offering sacred objects to the gods and receiving blessings from divine figures. These images were designed to reinforce the idea that the royal family was united and chosen by the gods to rule Egypt forever. For ordinary Egyptians who saw these carvings on temple walls, the queen represented grace, fertility, and the continuity of royal power. Few could imagine the complex and often dangerous reality that existed behind the palace walls. Modern historians, archaeologists, and scholars continue to piece together the stories of these remarkable women through inscriptions, tomb discoveries, and ancient documents that have survived thousands of years beneath the desert sands. Each discovery adds new insight into how queens shaped the history of one of the world's most fascinating civilizations. What becomes increasingly clear is that the queens of ancient Egypt were far more than ceremonial figures standing quietly beside powerful kings. They were political actors, religious leaders, mothers of dynasties, and sometimes rulers in their own right. Their lives were defined by extraordinary privilege but also by extraordinary risk. To stand beside the throne of Egypt meant living at the center of one of the most powerful empires of the ancient world, surrounded by unimaginable wealth and divine symbolism. Yet it also meant living within a system where power could shift suddenly and where the struggle for influence never truly ended. The story of Egyptian queens therefore reveals a powerful paradox. They were among the most respected women of the ancient world, honored in art and religion as symbols of divine authority. At the same time, their lives were shaped by political pressures and personal dangers that few outside the palace could fully understand. Their crowns represented not only glory and prestige, but also responsibility, expectation, and constant vigilance. To be a queen in ancient Egypt was to live in a world where power and vulnerability existed side by side, where divine honor could coexist with human ambition, and where the brilliance of royal life often concealed a far more complex and unsettling reality hidden behind the golden walls of the palace. One of the most disturbing realities of ancient Egyptian royalty was the practice of royal family marriages. In the world of ancient Egyptian kings and queens, marriage was rarely about love, companionship, or personal happiness. Instead, it was a powerful political and religious tool designed to protect the royal bloodline and maintain the divine authority of the throne. To modern readers, this system can seem shocking, but for the people of ancient Egypt it was deeply connected to their understanding of the universe, their gods, and the sacred nature of kingship. The pharaoh was not seen as an ordinary human ruler. Egyptians believed that the king was a living embodiment of the gods on earth, often associated with divine figures such as Horus during his lifetime, and with Osiris after death. Because of this belief, the royal family itself was considered sacred. The bloodline of the pharaoh was thought to carry divine power, and maintaining the purity of that bloodline became one of the most important goals of the royal court. This belief led to marriage practices that today seem disturbing and controversial. Pharaohs often married their own sisters or half-sisters in order to keep royal blood within the family. Sometimes these marriages were symbolic political unions meant to reinforce legitimacy, but in many cases they were real marital relationships that produced heirs to the throne. For royal daughters, this meant that their future was usually decided from the moment they were born. A princess was not simply a member of the royal household, she was a crucial piece in the political and religious machinery of the kingdom. Her marriage could determine who inherited the throne, who gained influence at court, and which faction of the royal family would control the future of Egypt. As a result, many princesses were raised with the expectation that they would eventually marry a close relative, often their own brother, who would become pharaoh. From a modern perspective, such arrangements may appear deeply unsettling, but in the religious worldview of ancient Egypt, they were seen as a reflection of divine patterns. Egyptian mythology included stories of gods who married within their own divine family. The relationship between Osiris and Isis, who were brother and sister as well as husband and wife, served as one of the most powerful models for royal marriage. Because the pharaoh was believed to mirror the gods on earth, royal marriages were sometimes presented as earthly reflections of these sacred divine relationships. In official art and inscriptions, these marriages were described as harmonious unions that strengthened the cosmic order known to Egyptians as Ma'at, the principle of balance and stability that governed the universe. Yet behind this religious justification existed a more practical political motivation. By arranging marriages within the royal family, pharaohs could prevent powerful noble families from gaining influence through marriage alliances. In many ancient societies, noble families could increase their power by marrying daughters into the royal household, eventually gaining control of the throne through their descendants. Egyptian rulers often tried to avoid this risk by keeping the most important royal marriages within their own bloodline. This strategy protected the dynasty but created a complex and often restrictive environment for the royal women who were part of these arrangements. For a princess, personal choice played almost no role in determining her future. Her value in the royal system was largely defined by her ability to strengthen the legitimacy of the dynasty and produce future rulers. In some cases, royal daughters were married while still extremely young. Historical records suggest that teenage marriages were not unusual among the elite classes of ancient Egypt, and within the royal family these marriages could occur even earlier when political circumstances demanded it. Once married, a queen entered a world filled with expectations and pressures that extended far beyond the typical responsibilities of marriage. Her most important duty was to produce children, especially sons who could inherit the throne and continue the royal line. The birth of a prince could instantly elevate a queen's status within the palace. If her son was recognized as the official heir, she might eventually become the king's mother, one of the most respected and influential titles in Egyptian society. However, the pressure to produce an heir could also create intense anxiety and competition within the royal household. Pharaohs often had multiple wives, including secondary wives and concubines who lived within the palace. Each of these women could potentially bear a son who might compete for the throne. As a result, royal marriage did not necessarily guarantee security or affection. Instead, it placed queens in a delicate and sometimes dangerous political position where their influence depended heavily on their ability to produce heirs and maintain the favor of the king. The situation could become even more complicated when royal marriages involved close relatives with competing claims to the throne. For example, a brother and sister who married each other might each carry strong royal lineage through both parents. Their children would therefore possess extremely powerful claims to kingship, but so might the children of other royal siblings who married within the family. This complex web of relationships could lead to disputes over succession, particularly when a pharaoh died without clearly naming a single heir. Throughout Egyptian history, there were periods when multiple princes claimed the throne, leading to rival factions within the palace. Queens often found themselves at the center of these struggles because the legitimacy of each prince was closely connected to the status of his mother. A queen whose son was favored by powerful officials or priests might gain enormous influence, while another queen whose son lost support could suddenly find herself isolated within the court. In such an environment, even family relationships could become politically charged. Brothers, sisters, mothers, and sons were not only relatives but also potential rivals in the struggle for power. The emotional consequences of such a system are difficult to fully understand today, but it is likely that royal women lived under constant pressure to maintain their position within the palace hierarchy. Some queens managed to transform this system into an opportunity for influence. By carefully managing alliances and building relationships with powerful court officials, we can build a strong and stable relationship. A queen could strengthen her position and ensure the success of her children. Others, however, may have experienced the royal marriage system as a restrictive and isolating environment where their personal lives were controlled by political necessity. Archaeological discoveries sometimes provide small glimpses into these human experiences. Tomb inscriptions, letters, and relief carvings occasionally show queens interacting with their children, participating in religious ceremonies, or appearing beside the king during important state events. These images suggest that royal women were expected to embody grace, loyalty, and devotion to both the pharaoh and the gods. Yet the absence of detailed personal records makes it difficult to know how these women truly felt about the roles assigned to them. What can be said with certainty is that royal marriage placed queens at the center of Egypt's political and religious structure. Their unions symbolized the continuity of the dynasty and the divine approval of the king's rule. At the same time, those marriages also created the foundation for many of the palace rivalries and conspiracies that appear in Egyptian historical records. Because succession depended so heavily on family relationships, even small changes within the royal household could have enormous consequences for the stability of the kingdom. The birth of a new prince, the death of a queen, or the rise of a favored secondary wife could shift the balance of power within the palace. In some cases, these shifts eventually contributed to dramatic political events, including conspiracies and attempts to place different heirs on the throne. Another important aspect of royal marriage in ancient Egypt was its role in diplomacy. While marriages between close relatives were common within the royal family, pharaohs sometimes also married foreign princesses in order to strengthen alliances with neighboring kingdoms. These diplomatic marriages created relationships between Egypt and powerful states in regions such as the Near East. Foreign princesses who married Egyptian pharaohs often brought large dowries, servants, and cultural traditions with them into the royal court. However, these women usually held a different status from the primary Egyptian queen. Because Egyptian ideology emphasized the divine purity of the royal bloodline, foreign wives were rarely allowed to become the official great royal wife. Instead, they often lived within the palace as secondary wives whose children might or might not be considered legitimate candidates for the throne. For Egyptian princesses, however, the expectation of marrying within the royal family remained strong. Their marriages were seen as essential for preserving the sacred lineage that connected the pharaoh to the gods. Over time, these practices contributed to a complex family structure in which siblings, cousins, and half-siblings were connected through multiple layers of marriage and parenthood. From the outside, this system might appear confusing, but within the context of ancient Egyptian culture, it formed a stable pattern that lasted for centuries. Even so, the system placed enormous responsibility on the shoulders of royal women. Their marriages were not private relationships but public institutions that carried political, religious, and dynastic significance. Every child they produced could potentially shape the future of the kingdom. Every alliance they formed within the palace could strengthen or weaken their position. Their lives were therefore closely watched by courtiers, priests, and officials who understood that the fate of the dynasty depended heavily on the stability of the royal household. The combination of sacred symbolism and political pressure made royal marriage both an honor and a burden. To be chosen as the primary queen of Egypt meant receiving immense respect and prestige, yet it also meant surrendering personal freedom in service of the dynasty. Queens were expected to present an image of harmony and devotion even when the realities of palace life were far more complicated. Publicly, they appeared beside the pharaoh in temple reliefs, participating in rituals that symbolized divine unity. Privately, they navigated a world where family relationships could easily become instruments of political strategy. Over the centuries, this system produced some of the most powerful and influential royal women in ancient history, but it also created an environment where personal lives were deeply shaped by the demands of kingship and divine ideology. For many queens, their marriages defined their entire existence within the royal court. They were born into a world where their future was determined long before they could make their own choices, and they spent their lives fulfilling roles that connected the human family of the pharaoh with the eternal authority of the gods. In this way, royal marriage became both the foundation of Egypt's dynastic power and one of the most complex and challenging aspects of life for the queens who lived within the golden yet demanding world of the ancient Egyptian palace. Life inside the royal harem of ancient Egypt was far more complex and tense than the luxurious image that often appears in modern imagination. When people hear the word harem, they often imagine a peaceful palace filled with comfort, music, and beauty, where royal women lived quiet lives surrounded by servants and luxury. In reality, the royal harem was one of the most politically charged environments in the entire Egyptian kingdom. It was a carefully organized institution that functioned not only as a living space for royal wives and children, but also as a center of education, administration, and sometimes dangerous rivalry. Within its walls lived dozens of women connected to the pharaoh. Queens, secondary wives, concubines, foreign princesses sent as diplomatic brides, royal daughters, and the children born to them. All of these individuals existed within a delicate hierarchy that determined their influence, security, and future. At the top of this hierarchy stood the primary queen, often called the Great Royal Wife, whose position was officially recognized in religious ceremonies and royal inscriptions. Beneath her were other wives and consorts whose status could vary depending on their family background, their relationship with the king, and most importantly, whether they had produced children for the royal family. Because the pharaoh was expected to produce multiple heirs in order to guarantee the stability of the dynasty, it was common for him to have many partners. Each woman within the royal household therefore represented a potential branch of the royal family, and each child born in the harem had the possibility of playing a role in Egypt's political future. This reality created an atmosphere where personal relationships and political ambitions were deeply intertwined. The women living in the royal harem were not simply companions of the king, but participants in a quiet struggle for influence that could shape the fate of the kingdom itself. The physical structure of the royal harem reflected both its luxury and its isolation. These compounds were often located within or near the main royal palace, but separated from the outside world by guarded walls and controlled entrances. Archaeological evidence from sites such as the palace complexes associated with rulers like Ramesses III suggests that these areas were large and carefully organized communities containing living quarters, gardens, storage buildings, workshops, and schools for royal children. Servants, guards, scribes, tutors, and administrators all worked within these compounds to support the daily lives of the royal household. Despite the presence of these staff members, the women of the harem lived under constant supervision and rarely moved freely outside the palace environment. Their world was largely confined to the carefully managed spaces of the royal residence. This isolation served multiple purposes. On one hand, it protected the royal family from potential threats and ensured that the pharaoh's children were raised within a controlled environment. On the other hand, it reinforced the idea that the royal household was a sacred space, separate from ordinary society. Within this enclosed world, daily life could appear comfortable and even elegant. The women of the harem wore fine linen garments, decorated themselves with jewelry made from gold and precious stones, and lived among beautifully painted walls and carefully maintained gardens. Music, storytelling, and religious rituals were common features of palace life. Many royal women were educated in reading, writing, and religious traditions, especially if they were expected to play ceremonial roles in temples. Young princes and princesses received instruction from tutors who taught them the traditions of Egyptian culture, statecraft, and religion. On the surface, this environment could seem refined and harmonious, yet beneath this outward appearance existed a constant undercurrent of competition. Because the future ruler of Egypt could be born to any woman within the harem, every birth carried enormous political importance. A woman who gave birth to a son might suddenly gain prestige and attention from powerful officials who hoped to align themselves with the future king. If that son eventually became heir to the throne, his mother's status would rise dramatically, potentially elevating her above other royal wives. This possibility encouraged quiet rivalries between the women of the palace. Even if they appeared friendly in public ceremonies, many were aware that their own security and influence depended on their position within the complex hierarchy of the harem. The birth of a prince could change everything overnight. A woman who had previously been considered a minor member of the royal household could suddenly become one of the most important figures in the palace if her child gained recognition as a potential successor. Conversely, A queen who failed to produce an heir might see her influence slowly fade as other women gained favor with the king. These shifts in status could affect not only the lives of the women themselves, but also the careers of officials, priests, and military leaders who sought to align themselves with the most powerful members of the royal family. As a result, the royal harem became a subtle but important arena of political strategy. Women formed alliances with one another, built relationships with influential court officials, and tried to secure advantages for their own children. Because these activities occurred behind palace walls, they rarely appeared directly in official historical records. Yet occasional discoveries provide hints of the tensions that existed within this environment. Letters, administrative documents, and trial records reveal that the royal harem was not immune to intrigue, conspiracy, and conflict. One of the most famous examples of this hidden tension emerged during the reign of Ramesses III, when a conspiracy later known as the Harem conspiracy attempted to overthrow the king. According to surviving trial documents, a secondary wife named Ti organized a secret plot within the royal household. Her goal was to replace the pharaoh's chosen heir with her own son, demonstrating how the rivalries within the harem could eventually grow into serious political threats. Although this event represents an extreme case, it highlights the potential consequences of the competitive environment that existed within the royal household. The presence of many royal children also added complexity to life within the harem. Princes and princesses grew up together in an environment that combined privilege with intense expectation. From an early age, they were aware that their position within the royal family could shape the future of Egypt. Some princes were educated specifically for leadership roles, preparing them to become military commanders, administrators, or eventually pharaohs. Others might be assigned positions within the priesthood or regional government, depending on their place within the royal hierarchy. For the mothers of these children, the success of their sons or daughters could determine their own long-term influence. A queen whose son became pharaoh might later serve as an advisor or regent, guiding the kingdom during the early years of his reign. This possibility gave mothers strong motivation to support their children's advancement within the royal court. At the same time, it also meant that relationships between different branches of the royal family could become strained. Each group of siblings represented a potential line of succession, and the competition for recognition as the official heir could create subtle divisions within the palace. Even the king himself had to manage these dynamics carefully. A pharaoh needed multiple heirs to ensure the continuity of the dynasty, but he also had to avoid creating rival factions that might challenge his chosen successor. Some rulers attempted to solve this problem by publicly naming a crown prince and associating him with the government while the king was still alive. This practice helped signal to the court which prince was expected to inherit the throne. However, even with such measures in place, the presence of many royal children and their ambitious supporters could still create tension. Within the walls of the royal harem, these political realities shaped everyday life. Conversations, friendships, and alliances could carry deeper meanings related to future power and influence. A servant delivering messages, a tutor educating a prince, or a court official visiting the palace might unknowingly become part of a large network of relationships that determined the balance of power within the royal family. Yet despite these pressures, the royal harem was also a place where genuine human relationships existed. Mothers cared for their children, sisters shared experiences, and friendships likely formed among women who spent much of their lives together within the palace walls. Artistic scenes from tombs and temples sometimes depict royal women interacting peacefully, suggesting that daily life included moments of cooperation and shared routine. They participated in religious festivals, offered prayers to the gods, and maintained the traditions that connected the royal family to Egypt's spiritual beliefs. Religious devotion played an important role in the lives of the women of the harem. Many queens and royal daughters held titles connected to temple worship, particularly in relation to powerful deities such as Ammon. Participation in temple rituals allowed royal women to reinforce the sacred nature of the royal family and strengthen the connection between the throne and the gods. These ceremonies also provided occasions when queens appeared publicly beside the king, presenting offerings and performing symbolic acts that represented the harmony of the kingdom. Even within the private world of the harem, religious practices remained an important part of daily life. Shrines, statues of gods, and sacred rituals helped maintain the spiritual identity of the royal household. For many of the women living there, these traditions may have provided comfort and a sense of purpose within a system that otherwise placed heavy expectations on their roles. Despite the beauty and refinement that surrounded them, the women of the royal harem lived with the awareness that their futures were uncertain. Their position could change depending on the health of the king, the birth of new children, or the shifting alliances within the court. Some women might rise to extraordinary prominence if their sons gained the throne, while others might fade quietly into obscurity if their branch of the royal family lost influence. Because Egyptian historical records were often shaped by the rulers who commissioned them, the stories of many royal women disappeared from official history when their descendants failed to maintain power. Statues could be removed, names erased, and monuments rededicated to later rulers. As a result, modern historians can only glimpse fragments of the lives that unfolded within the royal harems of ancient Egypt. Yet those fragments reveal an environment that was far more dynamic and complicated than the simple image of luxury that is often imagined. The royal harem was a community where privilege and pressure existed side by side, where elegance and rivalry were part of the same daily reality. It was a place where the mothers of future kings lived alongside women whose names would never be recorded, where children played in palace gardens while political ambitions quietly shaped their destinies. Within its guarded walls, the personal lives of royal women became inseparable from the political future of one of the greatest civilizations of the ancient world. Ancient Egyptian history contains many stories of political intrigue, secret rivalries, and hidden struggles for power. But some of the most disturbing and dramatic events took place within the walls of the royal palace itself. The palace was not only the residence of the pharaoh and his family, it was also the center of political authority, religious symbolism, and the administrative machinery that governed one of the most powerful civilizations of the ancient world. Within this environment, where immense power was concentrated in the hands of a single ruler and his household, conspiracies sometimes emerged that threatened the stability of the entire kingdom. Among the most shocking examples of these palace intrigues is the conspiracy that occurred during the reign of Ramesses III, an event that modern historians often refer to as the Harem conspiracy. This plot reveals how the rivalries and ambitions that existed within the royal household could escalate into a dangerous attempt to overthrow the king himself. The story of this conspiracy provides a rare glimpse into the hidden tensions of palace life and the lengths to which some individuals were willing to go in their struggle for power. During the reign of Ramesses III, Egypt was still a formidable empire, though it faced growing challenges from both internal and external pressures. Ramesses III is often remembered as one of the last great warrior kings of the New Kingdom, known for defending Egypt against invading groups, sometimes called the Sea Peoples. His victories helped maintain Egypt's strength during a period when many other ancient civilizations were collapsing. Yet even as he defended his kingdom from foreign threats, danger was quietly developing within his own palace. According to surviving historical records, a secondary wife of the pharaoh named Tia became the central figure in a secret plan to remove the king from power. Tia was not the primary queen of Egypt, and therefore her son was not the official heir to the throne. In a royal household where succession determined the future of the dynasty, this meant that her child faced limited chances of becoming the next pharaoh. Rather than accept this reality, Ti appears to have organized a network of supporters who hoped to change the course of Egypt's political future. Their plan was bold and extremely dangerous. They intended to assassinate the pharaoh and place Ti's son on the throne instead of the official crown prince. The conspiracy involved a surprisingly large number of participants drawn from different parts of the royal court. Ancient trial documents discovered by historians describe how palace servants, military officers, administrators, and even individuals connected to religious or magical practices became involved in the plot. These records are preserved in documents such as the Judicial Papyrus of Turin, which provides a detailed account of the investigation and trial that followed the conspiracy. The fact that so many individuals participated suggests that dissatisfaction or ambition within the palace had created an environment where some people believed such a plan might succeed. For Ti and her allies, the palace itself became the center of their secret activities. Because the royal household was a complex community filled with officials and servants moving through its corridors each day, it offered opportunities for conspirators to communicate and coordinate their actions without immediately attracting attention. Messages could be passed through trusted servants, meetings could take place in private rooms, and alliances could form quietly among individuals who shared a common goal. According to the surviving records, the conspirators attempted to recruit supporters throughout the palace and even beyond its walls. Some of the participants were believed to have used magical rituals or written spells in an effort to weaken the king and ensure the success of their plan. Magic played an important role in ancient Egyptian culture, and many people believed that written spells and ritual practices could influence events in the physical world. The conspirators appear to have taken advantage of this belief, hoping that supernatural assistance might help them overthrow the pharaoh. In addition to magical practices, the plot also relied on the cooperation of individuals who held positions of authority within the palace administration. Guards, officials, and servants who normally served the king became part of a hidden network working against him. The exact details of how the assassination was intended to occur remain uncertain, but the records suggest that the conspirators planned to create chaos within the palace at the same time the attack on the pharaoh was carried out. By creating confusion and unrest, they hoped to weaken the royal government and allow Ti's son to seize the throne before loyal supporters of the king could respond. For centuries, historians debated whether this plan ever succeeded in harming the pharaoh. The ancient documents describing the conspiracy focus primarily on the investigation and punishment of those involved, rather than on the exact outcome of the assassination attempt. As a result, the fate of Ramesses III remains somewhat mysterious. Some scholars believe the plot may have been discovered before it could be carried out, while others suspected that the king might actually have been killed as part of the conspiracy. In the early 21st century, modern scientific research provided a dramatic answer to this question. Using advanced medical imaging technology to examine the mummy of Ramesses III, researchers discovered a deep wound across the throat of the ancient ruler. The injury was so severe that it likely caused immediate death, strongly suggesting that the pharaoh had indeed been assassinated. This discovery transformed the Harem conspiracy from a suspected plot into what appears to have been one of the earliest recorded royal assassinations in history. If the conspirators succeeded in killing the king, their victory was short-lived. The surviving records show that the plot was eventually uncovered and that a large investigation followed. Egyptian officials conducted trials in which many of the conspirators were accused of treason against the pharaoh and the state. The trial documents describe how judges examined evidence, questioned the accused, and delivered punishments that reflected the seriousness of the crime. Some conspirators were executed immediately, while others were forced to take their own lives as a form of punishment that avoided the dishonor of public execution. A few individuals received lesser penalties depending on their level of involvement in the plot. The documents also suggest that some judges themselves may have behaved improperly during the trial, possibly accepting bribes or engaging in misconduct with members of the royal household. If true, this detail reveals just how deeply the corruption and intrigue associated with the conspiracy had spread within the palace environment. The fate of Ti herself remains somewhat uncertain, though historical records strongly suggest that she was punished for her role in the conspiracy. Her son, who had been intended as the replacement king, never gained the throne. Instead, the official heir eventually became pharaoh, ensuring that the legitimate royal line continued despite the attempt to overthrow it. The Harem conspiracy stands as one of the most dramatic examples of palace intrigue in ancient Egypt, because it demonstrates how rivalries within the royal household could escalate into violent political conflict. The women of the royal harem were often perceived as living quiet lives within the protected environment of the palace, yet this event reveals that they could also become central figures in major political struggles. Ti's involvement shows that royal women were capable of organizing alliances, coordinating supporters, and influencing the course of history, even if their actions ultimately failed. At the same time, the conspiracy highlights the vulnerability of even the most powerful rulers. The pharaohs were surrounded by guards, servants, and officials who were expected to protect them. Yet the very people who lived and worked within the palace could also become potential threats. The concentration of power within the royal household meant that the stakes of palace politics were incredibly high. Whoever controlled the throne controlled the wealth, military power, and religious authority of the entire kingdom. As a result, individuals who believed they had a chance to seize that power sometimes took extraordinary risks to achieve their goals. The harem conspiracy therefore provides a rare window into the darker side of royal life in ancient Egypt. Behind the grand temples and monumental statues that celebrated the glory of the pharaoh lay a complex human world filled with ambition, jealousy, and political calculation. Queens, princes, servants, and officials all lived within a system where loyalty and betrayal could determine the future of the dynasty. Although the official art and inscriptions of Egypt often portrayed the royal family as harmonious and divinely favored, the reality behind palace walls could be far more complicated. The conspiracy against Ramesses III reminds us that even in a civilization famous for its stability and grandeur, the struggle for power could become intensely personal and dangerously unpredictable. It also reveals how the private lives of the royal household were deeply connected to the fate of the entire nation. A conflict within the palace could lead to assassination attempts, political trials, and dramatic shifts in the leadership of the kingdom. In this way, the story of the Harem conspiracy stands as both a historical mystery and a powerful reminder that the lives of ancient Egyptian queens and royal women were far more complex than the elegant images carved into temple walls. Beneath those images existed a hidden world of alliances, ambitions, and dangerous decisions that shaped the history of one of the greatest civilizations the world has ever known. Despite the dangers, restrictions, and intense political pressures that surrounded royal life in ancient Egypt, there were rare moments in history when queens rose beyond the traditional role of royal consort and became rulers in their own right. In a civilization where kingship was closely connected to divine authority and where most political power was expected to pass through male rulers, the emergence of female pharaohs stands as one of the most remarkable aspects of Egyptian history. These women navigated a complex system of traditions, expectations, and political realities to claim authority that was normally reserved for men. Their stories reveal both the possibilities and the risks faced by royal women who attempted to exercise power in a system designed primarily for male rulers. Among these queens, one of the most famous and influential figures was Hatshepsut, a woman whose reign would become one of the most fascinating chapters in the history of ancient Egypt. Her rise to power demonstrates how intelligence, political skill, and careful use of religious symbolism could allow a queen to transform herself into a pharaoh. Hatshepsut was born into the powerful royal family of the 18th dynasty, a period that marked the beginning of Egypt's new kingdom, one of the most prosperous and expansive eras in Egyptian history. She was the daughter of the pharaoh Thutmose I and the queen Omos. As a princess growing up within the royal court, Hatshepsut would have received an education appropriate for someone of high status. Royal daughters were often taught reading, writing, religious rituals, and the traditions that governed Egyptian society. From an early age, she would have been exposed to the ceremonial life of the palace and the responsibilities associated with royal authority. In accordance with the traditions of the royal family, Hatshepsut later married her half-brother Thutmose II, who became pharaoh after the death of their father. Through this marriage, she gained the prestigious title of Great Royal Wife, placing her at the center of the royal household and the religious ceremonies that supported the king's authority. However, the reign of Thutmose II was relatively short, and his death created a complicated political situation. The rightful heir to the throne was a young boy named Thutmose III, the son of Thutmose II by a secondary wife. Because the boy was still very young when his father died, Hatshepsut initially assumed the role of regent, governing Egypt on behalf of the child king until he was old enough to rule independently. At first, this arrangement followed established traditions. Queens had occasionally served as regents in Egyptian history, guiding the kingdom during periods when the heir was too young to take full control. Yet over time, Hatshepsut's role began to change in ways that were highly unusual. Rather than stepping aside once the young king grew older, she gradually expanded her authority and eventually declared herself pharaoh. This decision transformed her from a regent acting on behalf of a child ruler into the sovereign leader of Egypt. To make this unprecedented transition possible, Hatshepsut used a combination of political strategy, religious symbolism, and careful presentation to convince the Egyptian elite that her rule was legitimate. One of the most striking aspects of her reign was the way she adopted the visual symbols traditionally associated with male kingship. In statues and temple reliefs, Hatshepsut was often depicted wearing the royal headdress, the ceremonial kilt, and even the false beard that symbolized the authority of the pharaoh. These images did not mean that she attempted to disguise her identity as a woman. Instead, they reflected the belief that the role of pharaoh itself carried specific symbols and traditions that had to be maintained regardless of the ruler's gender. By adopting these symbols, Hatshepsut demonstrated that she was not merely acting as a queen but fully embracing the sacred office of kingship. Her inscriptions also emphasized divine approval for her reign. According to some temple carvings, the god Ammon himself had chosen her to rule Egypt. These stories described how the god visited her mother and proclaimed that Hatshepsut would one day become pharaoh, presenting her rule as part of a divine plan rather than a political ambition. Such narratives helped strengthen her legitimacy among priests and officials, who believed that the gods guided the fate of the kingdom. While some members of the royal court may have been skeptical of a female pharaoh, Hatshepsut appears to have maintained strong support from powerful officials who served as administrators, military leaders, and religious authorities. One of her most trusted supporters was a high-ranking official named Senenmut, who supervised many of the building projects that characterized her reign. Hatshepsut's rule is often remembered as a period of stability, prosperity, and impressive architectural achievements. Instead of focusing primarily on military conquest, she directed significant resources toward trade expeditions and monumental construction. One of the most famous achievements of her reign was the trading expedition to the mysterious land known as Punt, a region believed to have been located somewhere along the Red Sea coast or in the Horn of Africa. Egyptian ships returned from this expedition carrying exotic goods such as incense, gold, ebony, and rare plants that were highly valued in religious ceremonies. Scenes carved into the walls of Hatshepsut's temple describe the journey in remarkable detail, celebrating it as a demonstration of Egypt's wealth and international connections. At the same time, Hatshepsut commissioned the construction of some of the most beautiful architectural works in Egyptian history. Her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri remains one of the most impressive monuments of the ancient world. Built against the dramatic cliffs of the western bank of the Nile near the city of Luxor, the temple features elegant terraces, long colonnades, and carefully designed pathways that create a sense of harmony between architecture and the surrounding landscape. This monument not only honored Hatshepsut after her death, but also served as a powerful statement of her authority during her lifetime. Despite the success of her reign, the story of Hatshepsut did not end peacefully. After her death, something strange happened to her memory within Egyptian history. Many of her statues were destroyed or defaced, and her name was removed from numerous monuments. In some cases, later rulers replaced her inscriptions with their own, attempting to erase her from the official record of Egyptian kings. For centuries, historians wondered why this campaign of destruction occurred. Some scholars believe that her successor, Thutmose III, ordered the removal of her monuments as an attempt to restore traditional male succession to the throne. Others argue that the erasure may have happened later, perhaps as part of a broader effort by later rulers to simplify the royal lineage. Whatever the reason, the attempt to remove Hatshepsut's legacy shows how controversial her reign may have appeared to those who followed her. By claiming the title of pharaoh, she challenged long-standing assumptions about gender and authority within Egyptian society. Even though her rule had been stable and prosperous, later generations may have viewed it as an unusual interruption in the traditional order of kingship. Yet the attempt to erase her ultimately failed. Archaeologists and historians eventually rediscovered her monuments, inscriptions, and statues, revealing the remarkable story of a queen who had transformed herself into one of Egypt's most successful rulers. Hatshepsut was not the only woman in Egyptian history to claim the throne, though she remains one of the most famous. Another notable female ruler was Sobekneferu, who ruled several centuries earlier. Like Hatshepsut, Sobekneferu adopted the symbols of kingship and governed Egypt during a transitional period in the country's history. Much later, during the final centuries of ancient Egyptian independence, another powerful queen would rule the land along the Nile. That queen was Cleopatra VII, whose political alliances and dramatic life would become legendary in both Egyptian and Roman history. Although Cleopatra lived in a different cultural period influenced by Greek traditions, her reign continued the long legacy of royal women who played central roles in Egypt's political life. The stories of these queens demonstrate that although ancient Egypt was largely dominated by male rulers, its political and religious traditions contained enough flexibility to allow exceptional women to rise to the highest position in the state. Achieving that position required extraordinary intelligence, strategic thinking, and the ability to navigate a complex system of expectations. Queens who attempted to rule as pharaohs had to convince priests, officials, and the broader population that their authority was legitimate and supported by the gods. They also had to manage the ambitions of rival members of the royal family who might see an opportunity to claim the throne for themselves. For these reasons, the reigns of female pharaohs were often surrounded by unique political challenges. Yet their success also reveals something remarkable about ancient Egyptian civilization. Unlike many other ancient societies, Egypt's religious and cultural traditions allowed the concept of kingship to be adapted when necessary. The idea that a woman could become pharaoh may have been unusual, but it was not impossible within the symbolic framework of Egyptian belief. When circumstances required it, the system could adjust to allow a capable ruler to maintain stability and continuity within the kingdom. In this way, the stories of queens who ruled as pharaohs highlight both the limitations and the possibilities faced by women in ancient Egypt. They lived in a society where political power was usually reserved for men, yet their royal status, religious connections, and personal abilities sometimes allowed them to transcend those limitations. Their reigns remind us that the history of Egypt was shaped not only by the famous kings whose names fill the lists of pharaohs, but also by remarkable women who stepped forward during moments of uncertainty and guided one of the world's greatest civilizations through periods of transformation and change. To the people of ancient Egypt, the image of the queen represented beauty, grace, and divine order. She appeared in temple carvings standing beside the pharaoh, dressed in elegant linen garments and adorned with elaborate jewelry made of gold, lapis lazuli, turquoise, and carnelian. Her posture in these carvings was always calm and dignified, often shown presenting offerings to the gods or supporting the king in sacred ceremonies. To the ordinary citizens who saw these images carved into temple walls or painted inside tombs, the queen appeared almost supernatural, a woman chosen by divine forces to share the throne with the ruler of the most powerful kingdom in the ancient world. The royal family as a whole was portrayed as the center of harmony within Egyptian society. The pharaoh was believed to be the earthly representative of the gods, and the queen stood beside him as a partner in maintaining cosmic balance, a concept known in Egyptian belief as Ma'at, the divine order that governed the universe. When people saw the royal couple participating in religious rituals or appearing together in official ceremonies, they were seen as a symbol of unity and harmony. They believed that these actions helped preserve stability in the world itself. Floods of the Nile, successful harvests, and peace throughout the kingdom were all believed to depend in part on the harmony of the royal household. Because of this belief, queens were treated with enormous respect and were often seen as symbols of fertility, protection, and divine favor. Yet the magnificent image presented to the public concealed a far more complicated reality. Behind the grand columns of temples and the golden halls of royal palaces, the lives of queens were shaped by pressures that few outside the palace could fully understand. Their position at the center of the royal court meant that they were constantly surrounded by political tensions, family rivalries, and the ever-present possibility that their influence could suddenly disappear. The crown that symbolized prestige and authority also carried a heavy burden of expectation. A queen was not simply a wife to the pharaoh, she was part of a powerful political institution whose stability affected the entire kingdom. Every action she took could have consequences for the balance of power within the royal family. One of the greatest sources of uncertainty for queens was the issue of succession. In a monarchy where the throne passed from one generation to the next, the birth of royal children determined the future of the dynasty. Queens were expected to produce heirs who could inherit the throne and continue the royal lineage that Egyptians believed had been blessed by the gods. If a queen gave birth to a son who became crown prince, her position within the palace could become incredibly strong. She might one day become the mother of the next pharaoh, one of the most respected roles in Egyptian society. However, if another royal wife gave birth to a more favored heir, the balance of influence within the palace could shift quickly. A queen who had once been central to the royal court might find herself gradually losing attention and authority as new figures rose to prominence. Because pharaohs often had multiple wives, the royal household included numerous princes and princesses who could potentially claim the throne. Each child represented a different branch of the royal family, and each branch might have supporters among the court officials, military leaders, and priests who influenced Egyptian politics. These rivalries were rarely visible to the public, but they shaped the internal dynamics of palace life. Queens had to navigate these relationships carefully, maintaining alliances and protecting the interests of their own children, while avoiding actions that might provoke open conflict. The uncertainty surrounding succession meant that the lives of royal women were often filled with quiet tension. Even within the luxurious environment of the palace, their futures depended on events they could not always control, such as the health of the king or the ambitions of rival family members. Some queens disappeared from the historical record entirely, leaving behind only fragments of evidence that they had ever existed. Their names might appear briefly in inscriptions or tombs, before fading from memory as later rulers reshaped the official history of the dynasty. This disappearance did not necessarily mean that their lives were unimportant, rather, it reflected the way historical records were controlled by those who held power. When a new ruler came to the throne, he often commissioned monuments and inscriptions that emphasized his own achievements and lineage. If a previous queen was associated with political conflict or a rival branch of the royal family, her memory might be deliberately removed from these records. Statues could be destroyed, names carved out of temple walls, and monuments rededicated to different rulers. Over time, these acts of erasure made it difficult for later generations to reconstruct the full story of many royal women. Yet archaeology has gradually revealed traces of their lives hidden beneath the sands of Egypt. Tomb discoveries, fragments of statues, and inscriptions on ancient papyri continue to provide glimpses into the complex world these queens inhabited. The discoveries remind us that the official version of history preserved by the pharaohs was only one part of a much larger human story. Another aspect of royal life that added to the uncertainty faced by queens was the constant presence of political intrigue within the palace. As the center of government, the palace attracted individuals seeking influence and advancement. Officials responsible for taxation, military command, temple administration, and foreign diplomacy all interacted with members of the royal family. Some of these officials formed close relationships with queens, hoping to gain favor or secure positions for themselves or their allies. While such alliances could strengthen a queen's position, they could also create new dangers if rival factions emerged within the court. A queen who became associated with a particular political group might find herself vulnerable if that group later lost power. Even trusted servants or advisors could become part of hidden rivalries that unfolded behind palace doors. The complexity of these relationships meant that royal women often had to act as skilled diplomats within their own household, balancing competing interests while maintaining the appearance of harmony required by Egyptian tradition. Despite these challenges, queens also played important roles in the religious life of Egypt. Many held titles connected to temple worship and participated in ceremonies honoring major deities such as Ammon. Through these rituals, they reinforced the sacred connection between the royal family and the gods, helping maintain the belief that the kingdom was protected by divine forces. Temples dedicated to these deities often received gifts from queens in the form of statues, jewelry, or land grants that supported religious institutions. These acts of devotion strengthened the relationship between the monarchy and the powerful priesthoods that influenced Egyptian society. In some cases, queens even held positions that allowed them to oversee temple estates and participate directly in religious administration. These responsibilities gave royal women opportunities to exercise authority beyond the palace walls, influencing economic and spiritual life throughout the kingdom. Yet even as they performed these sacred duties, queens remained aware that their personal security was tied to the stability of the royal court. The death of a pharaoh could transform their lives overnight. If their son became the new king, they might gain enormous prestige as the king's mother. But if another prince inherited the throne, the former queen could lose influence or even be removed from the palace entirely. The transition between reigns was therefore a moment of both opportunity and danger for royal women. The queens successfully navigated these transitions, maintaining their status and continuing to play influential roles in the new reign. Others vanished quietly from the historical record, their fate unknown. The passage of time has blurred many of these stories, leaving modern historians to reconstruct them from scattered evidence. Yet the fragments that survive reveal a world where royal women lived lives far more complex than the serene images carved into temple walls might suggest. Their days were filled with ceremonial duties, family responsibilities, and political calculations that shaped the future of one of the greatest civilizations of the ancient world. To the public, they represented divine grace and stability, symbols of a kingdom blessed by the gods. Within the palace, they were participants in a delicate balance of power where alliances could shift and fortunes could change with surprising speed. The contrast between these two realities forms one of the most fascinating aspects of ancient Egyptian history. The queen was both a sacred icon and a human being navigating the uncertainties of royal life. Her crown symbolized divine authority, yet it also placed her at the center of a system where every decision carried consequences for the dynasty. The grandeur of Egypt's temples and monuments has preserved the memory of its rulers for thousands of years, but those monuments also conceal the personal struggles that shaped the lives of the people who stood behind the throne. For the queens of ancient Egypt, life within the palace was a constant balance between privilege and vulnerability. They lived surrounded by luxury and reverence, yet they also faced pressures that could alter their destiny in ways that history has only partially recorded. The golden crowns and elaborate ceremonies that symbolized their power were only one side of their story. beneath that brilliant surface lay a quieter, more uncertain world where ambition, loyalty, and survival were intertwined with the fate of the Egyptian empire itself.